Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the Walking Chicken podcast with me, Shadeblade.
And me, Telly.
Yeah, there we go. I know it's been a while, but we're back and hopefully going to do this a little more frequently.
Yeah, we've both been busy, so
Yeah,
yeah,
easy. Um, but anyway, we'll start things off with uh, Dishonored 2, and well, just Dishonored in general. New
yeah.
new game coming out. Pretty sure by now they realize we're fans of Bethesda games.
Oh yeah, no, it's Dishonored, one of my favorite games. To be completely clear,
Oh yeah,
I think if it were not for BioShock Infinite, Dishonored would have been the best game of the year it came out, hands down.
oh yeah. The best way I can ever describe Dishonored for anyone who hasn't played it is as much as it's a shot at Ubisoft, it's Assassin's Creed done right.
Assassin's Creed done right. It's a it's the oil painting that plays like a Dumas novel.
Sure. I don't exactly know what that means, but we'll roll with it.
Sorry, hey, Alexander Dumas wrote The Count of Monte Cristo, the assassination story.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, and which is and actually sort of segueing into it, one of my favorite things about the Dishonored series that the artistic design
Hmm.
and the way they chose to render the characters looks like an impressionist oil painting, and that's just gorgeous.
Oh
None of
yeah, it
this,
is.
none of this ultra realism, none of this
Yeah,
trying to claim the mantle of high fidelity graphics. No, it looks like an oil painting, and the game works because it. And the game really works because of it.
yeah, and the fact that games that don't go for like the super realistic graphics tend to age better, like visual wise. So like you can come back. I recently went back a couple weeks ago, played through Dishonored 1 again, and it still looks good. And I've played like Fallout 4 and stuff that's come out years after.
Yeah. Well, that's because they're not trying to compete with the graphical fidelity. They're not trying to
Yeah,
have the highest resolution. They're not trying to do all of these things. And so the graphics,
yeah.
they can take a chance on the graphics, and that's I think where Dishonored really shines. One of the places where it really shines.
Yeah, they
That
decided to take a chance on the graphics in exchange for making a fun game. Imagine that.
I
Someone
know.
call up
The only,
Activision.
huh, I think the only downside is that the game was a little too short for my taste. I think it could have been a bit longer, could have had a little more content to it, but that's a personal thing.
Yeah,
I mean, the game was still amazing.
yeah. It also had the two DLCs, but
Eh,
I never actually played those. I think I have them. I never actually played them. I should do
I
that.
I didn't bother with them. I think it worked as a well as a single contained story.
Yeah, like I don't know where they unless it was a totally different story, I don't know how they would expand on that story. It was very well done.
Yeah, no, and my God, it was complete. Like
Yeah.
it had a middle and end, and they had no need for like for stretching or coming up with a cliffhanger or no, it was just they told the story they were looking to tell.
Yeah. Okay, so I think enough
Enough effusive praise of
yeah.
Dishonored
Let's
because
talk
Dishonored
about
2.
yeah, yeah. I'd say let's talk about one of the problems I've sort of thought about with Dishonored 2 being released is the events of Dishonored 2 happened 15 years after the events of Dishonored 1, aka the events of the Rat Plague. Um, However, and I'm going off track here. Dishonored 2 takes place when Emily, the one you're trying to save in Dishonored 1, uh, gets dethroned. However, at the at the end of Dishonored 1, in the ending cutscene, it says that at the height of Emily's rule, Corvo dies. But in Dishonored 2, you can play as both Corvo and Emily. So I'm not sure if like it either spoils the ending of Dishonored 2 by saying that Emily ends up getting back on the throne. That, or there's just kind of a major plot hole between the two. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, I think I think it doesn't necessarily spoil the ending of Dishonored 2 because Dishonored was never at Dishonored 1 at least was never about the ending. It seems to me to be about the story, how one gets from the beginning to the middle to the end,
Mm-hmm.
and that twist endings or the endings in general didn't matter so much as the experience the player had.
Yeah. Well, I
And
guess, yeah.
I think I agree. I think that my heart of hearts, Dishonored 2 is going to have a good ending and a bad ending, and that the good ending is Emily being restored to the throne. Because we already know how it starts. Arcane basically spoiled it,
Yeah.
so if they're spoiling it, who cares? Emily is uh, Emily is dethroned by what's her name from the DLC that I didn't play or care about.
Yeah.
Um, and she goes to Karnaka for some reason to take back her throne,
Yeah.
which is, it's about the experience. It's not about the twist ending or the ending or what or what happens. It's about how we get there, and that I think the endings are designed to be the cherry on the cake, the reward for the story played as the player wants to play it.
Okay, but that also brings up another problem with the last cutscene of Dishonored 1.
Yeah.
Was, for the good ending, the canon ending, if you, it says pretty much after Emily's put on the throne, Corvo just sort of helps guide her to make the right decisions and doesn't let people take advantage of her. And that's all it says. It doesn't mention anything about her traveling or anything like that. It just says Corvo's there to guide her, and then at the height of her rule, Corvo dies. Like, that's pretty big thing to gloss over. It sort of makes me think that they,
Well, here's the thing. I'll interrupt you. Here's the thing. Do they do they need to have talked about that? If Corvo is guiding her, if Corvo is like taking this active part in the in leading Emily down the path of goodness, etc., then I guess what is it? What does it matter if they don't tell the entire story in the end credits of Dishonored 1? Like it's a gloss. It's sort of a it's
yeah, but just
and
saying like everything was peaceful when suddenly this happened. It sort of makes me think at first they didn't expect to be making a sequel. Like they just wanted to be a one and done game.
I don't even think it's they wanted to be a one and done game. They just didn't expect to make a sequel,
Yeah, okay.
and that's a fair criticism.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's literary openness. Plus, plus at the same time, if you remember back to the good ending, um,
Mm-hmm.
Emily is old. Emily is, I mean, for a video game character, clearly older than 25 um, when she is uh, at Corvo's tomb, essentially. Like her hair is starting to slowly go, starting to go gray.
Okay, yeah.
She's older. She's older than she is in this game.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not a cut and dry thing. Still, that's all literary decisions.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah, because I'm actually really interested in the game in talking about the gameplay a little bit because the gameplay looks absolutely for the new Dishonored looks absolutely amazing.
Oh yeah, it does.
Yeah, the powers especially are
Mm-hmm.
interesting.
How like you can play as Corvo and get all the powers of Dishonored 1 pretty much, or you can play as Emily and have a whole new set of powers, which is kind of neat.
But yeah, especially because Emily's powers are really interesting looking.
Oh yeah.
Because it feels like they went for sort of a cosmic horror feeling with her powers, as opposed to Corvo's sort of very clean, um, very traditional fantasy type powers.
Yeah, well, like
And
it,
yeah, go on.
it sort of fits for Corvo's power sort of fit for him because for the longest time he was a bodyguard. He was sort of a soldier. He's a fully trained soldier. Emily, I can't really ever been trained as a fighter,
True,
so
but still,
it's
these are powers granted by a very sort of ephemeral, ethereal,
yeah,
otherworldly being. Like it's not like they choose. It's not like Corvo chose to have Blink.
yeah, I guess.
Like then that what I mean is her powers are feel like they're calling back much more to H.P. Lovecraft and other writers of the cosmic horror era, where like Emily becomes the shadow on the wall, the sort of creeping beast in the darkness, as opposed to Corvo, who just flicks from point A to point B.
Yeah, well,
There's
I
a
think
very different
that
stylistic there's a very different stylistic ethic going on between the two sets of powers.
Yeah, well, I think it fits for her to have more of the stealth base because, as I said, she probably wasn't trained in combat like Corvo was, so she's probably not going to be the type of character that can really go head to head with people. It'll more likely be she'll be sort of the more stealth oriented one. Like, don't get me wrong, Corvo
Yeah,
is very effective with stealth, but
yeah. Well, frankly, I think Corvo is only ineffective with the stealth if you play the game wrong. And I don't mean
yeah,
like if you play the game wrong as in you're like it's objectively wrong, but if you like if what I mean is if you like play the game suboptimally, if you will,
yeah,
because his powers make it in theory incredibly easy to be stealthy.
or just break the last level of the game like I did on recording.
Yeah, well, we can't all do.
Wait, you want me to climb up to the enemies? No, I'm just gonna climb up the side of the tower using Blink.
Didn't everyone do that?
Mm, you'd be surprised.
Okay, well, maybe people don't think it completely logically.
Yeah, I guess.
Anyway, um, another thing that I really like is the visual design of Karnaka as we've seen it so far.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, very sort of, I mean, besides the obvious Southern European influences, the influence of um, the Italian cities of the 1800s, southern France, Spain, etc.
Mm-hmm.
I I also like the French Foreign Legion flavor of the guards, and I think a lot of the sort of French influences that are very evident in Dishonored 2 as we've seen it. The the French Foreign Legion esque guards, the sort of Southern European quasi Algerian coast, the quasi Algerian coastline visual design of the city. Like I think they pay a lot of homage to Arcane Studios' origins in France. If I remember correctly, they're based in Lyon.
Mm-hmm.
So very like I think it much more than Dishonored 1. It ties into like where they're coming from. Plus, it's always great to see very a very popular game developed by somebody from well the continent because you never really see that much these days. Something that's from not North America or not Japan.
Yeah, I was about to say, not all games come out of North America. There's some really weird ones that come out of Japan. But there's a lot of weird things that come out of Japan.
There's a lot of weird things that come out of North America as well.
Yep.
Like Madden games. My God, those are the weirdest thing ever.
Hmm. Here's the thing. How do you feel about them changing the upgrade system from the way it was before, where you just collect the runes and then put it into whatever skill you want, to an entire skill tree, sort of MMO-esque?
I think it was bound to happen. I don't. I think that
Yeah.
I think that the. Well, I don't even think Dishonored 1's upgrade system was very much a product of its time.
Hmm.
Like especially if you look at the other major release of that year or around that time, Bioshock Infinite, it had very much the same type of skill tree,
Yeah,
or not skill upgrade system, where it was just a straight linear upgrade, and that's whatever. It's a product of its time.
yeah. See, the two problems with those upgrade systems I found as someone who's played a lot of games in the time is the very
Yeah.
linear one. It doesn't give you a if you could you there's a point where you reach too many skills where you can't feasibly think that you're gonna be able to do a lot. Um, However, with a skill tree, it allows for more skills, but then you end up having to put points into skills you don't care about in order to get access to skills you do care about.
Yeah,
So,
I think there are pros and cons to both. It's just that skill trees are where gaming is going.
mhm,
Like if it's sort of a best possible compromise, if you will,
yeah,
which is I don't know. It works.
yeah, it does.
I mean, it's again a product of its time, just as much as the previous skill system was a product of its time. We're not like there's only so much you can say about it.
Mhm,
What my worry is more that I think they're going to be doing too much in Dishonored 2. I think they're almost trying to bite off more than they could chew. Particularly because they said they'd be paying a lot more attention to building up the non-lethal takedowns,
mhm,
which is good. The non-lethal takedowns in Dishonored were kind of crappy. Like, let's be honest, they were kind of crappy.
mhm.
I enjoyed them, but they weren't the most satisfying for the amount of work that was required to pull them off. And I think by focusing a lot more on that, they might almost be biting off more than they could chew because they're almost building an entirely new world,
Mhm.
if you will, and also upgrading the skill tree and up making a game with two fully voiced characters and in some instances like really pushing the boundaries of how gameplay works to tell a story, and they're doing all of these things. I'm afraid we might end up with one of these games that's almost a bit um, split personality, where the tone doesn't completely fit.
Yeah,
I mean, I have great faith in Arcane. Arcane is amazing.
we might have a Bioshock 2.
Oh, don't remind me.
Aw. Bioshock 2's only problem was the fact that it was called a Bioshock game.
Yeah, really. Well, that and it was a basic carbon copy of Bioshock One.
Well, okay, it was a carbon copy of one segment of Bioshock 1,
Yeah.
just stretched out.
Well, I mean philosophically as well. Like
Yeah,
it basically, if Bioshock One was a ripping takedown of objectivism, then Bioshock Two was a ripping takedown of communism,
yeah.
and that only works once when you do it in that setting.
Hmm.
Um,
Um, I
I
hear.
think the,
Oh, you go
well,
ahead.
I think there is, however, a lot of good reason to be excited about Dishonored 2 and how Dishonored 2 is building up its setting and trying to keep things integrated. Because if you listen to the articles and the reviews
Hmm.
of that, that not the reviews, if we listen to the talks that are being given by Arcane representatives, if we listen to some of the things that are being said, look at the gameplay of it, they're really working hard to integrate the world, and that's
Hmm.
and to make the world make sense, which is a really strong which is a really strong statement that they've got commitment to making this game a coherent whole.
Yeah.
I mean, it makes um, I think that's good. I mean, because Dishonored games always have a sort of a very strong sense of place,
Hmm.
very strong sense of place. I've been to London a couple of times, and I lived in Edinburgh for a while, and um, like Dishonored One really spoke to those kind of places, like Clavering Boulevard, for example. really reminded me of the street's name. It completely escapes me. Oh God, it completely escapes me. Clavering Boulevard really reminded me of the Cowgate in Edinburgh.
Okay.
Very sort of tall, stately buildings, series of gates leading into a sort of less tall, like a less stately area. Like it was like they had walked some of those streets,
Hmm.
and it was really good for it. Like it really grounded you in these places and made and drew a tangible sense of place to mind.
Well, that's something a lot of game companies do if they're making a sort of a, even if it's a fantasy world, if there's like a place on Earth that's similar to what they have in mind, they'll actually just send their team and travel there and just wander around and get sort of the lay of the land type deal. I know Ubisoft is a big culprit for that with the Assassin's Creed games. I guess they are sort of supposed to be set in real world places, but at the time you just think they make an Assassin's Creed game just to be able to travel to that point and
Yeah, I know. Assassin's Creed, the one set in Italy was especially bad for that. I, in my undergraduate degree, I studied Venetian history.
hmm.
The map of Venice was all wrong. It's something I'll never be able to get my head around. The map of Venice is just wrong. Like this, the Basilica de San Marco, the, the main piazza. They're like all the things that tourists will see are in the right places,
Uh-huh.
but the layout of the neighborhoods is all wrong, and not just wrong for the period that the game is set in, but like no relation to the actual events,
Yeah,
like
but
none
you
whatsoever.
notice that a lot more than most people because I mean, I didn't really
Well,
pay
yeah,
much attention to geography and
I also took a course on the history of Venice.
yeah, so
Yeah, so it's like I recognize that, but if they're going to go to these places and like really use that information,
hmm.
um,
You're saying they should do a little more research then.
yeah, they should do a little more research. Rome was also a bad culprit for that. They got Rome wrong too, very very wrong, because they had this sort of grand vision of an imperial Rome when Rome was much more run down, and it was I think they put the Capitoline Hill in the wrong place, if I remember correctly. It was either the Capitoline or the Palatine Hill. They put it in the wrong place,
Hmm.
and that's another thing that just doesn't. My brain rebels.
And I bet you it bugs a lot of people that in the Assassin's Creed 2 and Brotherhood, you end up fighting the Pope.
That's the least of the issues with Assassin's Creed. Like,
There's some
including the fact,
people that are into religion to the point where that would actually be ba- a problem for them.
well, yes, obviously, but I'm like thinking more about the fact that the game's story doesn't make sense
Hmm.
from Assassin's Creed, the one set in the American Revolution onward. Because correct me if I'm wrong, isn't the in Assassin's Creed isn't the aren't the Masons a part of the Templars?
I think.
Yeah, see, if I
Hmm.
remember correctly, Masons are a part of the Templars. But like every single founding father in the United States was a Mason. Like every single one of them. I think only one of them wasn't.
Yeah.
Like so you're fighting for the Templars against the Templars.
Yeah.
Like, okay, you can't tell a story about a about assassins fighting against your classic array of secret society enemies and still have America coming out as the good guy. Like it's either a fundamental leap of logic or deliberate ignorance of American history.
Hmm.
Like it's like anything set during the Civil War. If you want to comment on the politics of the time, it gets messy. Not even the racial politics, just like the fact that at the time the Republican Party was a left wing party. That's a pretty rough hurdle for a lot of people to get around these days.
Hmm.
It's these what is it? I don't want to say atemporality because that's something else. It's a deliberate failure to historicize one's work.
Hmm.
But that's getting far off topic. That's getting far off topic because especially because Dishonored as a series really does well in historicizing itself
Mm-hmm.
because what they did really well is to not just to give things a sense of place, but to give things a sense of history what what was there in that place before the thing that's there now. At times you can kind of see this was a grand building that got run down and is now part of a slum, and you could sort of see the story written into the architecture.
Yeah, and this was a old brewery that is now taken over by thugs, and it's their base.
It's not even that. It's not just that it's an old brewery. It's that it's an old brewery that matches with other buildings in the city
Mm-hmm.
that have their own sort of place, and together those tell a story. I'm not
Mm-hmm.
going to get into all of this because that would be granularity to the point of madness.
The story of how Corvo runs across the rooftops because he just teleported up there.
Well, yeah, but there's more. There's more, but
Mm-hmm.
again, we're not going to. Yeah, I will say though, one of the things I really like is that they did move away from the whale punk that they
Yeah.
had in Dishonored One. Not that that was bad. I like whale punk. Dishonored was what sold me on whale punk,
Mm-hmm.
my term for a whale oil driven society.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I like that they moved away from that to sort of almost emphasize that Dunwall was the center of was the center of the empire, this big industrial hub, and that it was at the cutting edge, whereas Karnaka is part of the same civilization, part of the same national grouping,
Mm-hmm.
but isn't and in the same place. They have whale oil, but they don't have as much of it. They don't have that same sort of heavy industry, and that things are much more
Which to anyone playing, less whale oil just means less throwing bombs at the enemies.
true. But on the other hand, it does mean more interesting gameplay.
Yeah.
Like it does mean that um, it creates new gameplay scenarios, particularly with the use of wind,
Mm-hmm.
because because if you saw the 14 minutes of gameplay, um, their use of wind is really interesting because it's not just a power source; it's also an environmental effect. It has all these different effects on in-game play that player can use
Mm-hmm.
and creates like a lot of opportunities for interesting interactions with the environment, with gameplay. Um,
One more thing before we move on to sort of the next topic thing. If you, I'm reading a thing right here that just says, Bethesda announced, that the special collector's edition Dishonored 2 that you pre-order off of their website,
hmm,
um, includes a 13.5-inch replica of Corvo's mask
okay,
and a zinc alloy replica of Emily's ring.
okay,
The only thing
that's a
the
pretty
Oh, and a propaganda poster.
well, yeah.
But it's just like I never paid much attention to the ring Emily wore.
She didn't wear a ring in Dishonored One.
Uh,
It might be a more important thing in Dishonored Two.
Probably.
Like that could be why they're including it.
Yeah, it's like so they're doing the so they went the Halo 3 route with the signature mask or helmet of the main character, and
I
anyone who gets it will wear it for like the first mission, then get annoyed with it and take it off and never put it back on.
probably, but I've got to say, I actually really don't like that kind of thing. I remember, I remember when games came with a manual and very often a map and like all these things, like all these extras,
Mm-hmm.
just automatically. and they were useful.
Mm-hmm.
They weren't like just baubles like Halo or Dishonored are doing. They were actual useful in-game tools, but they also helped flesh out the game into the real world and create a much stronger sense of the experience. I mean, Mist was the best for that. I love Mist. I need to buy it again, but
Well,
like
what one?
Mist came with a journal, like it, an actual journal to talk about or to write down your experience so that you could actually make it through the game easier. And it chimed with the theme of the game of imagining worlds through writing.
Mm-hmm.
And it was a really, I think, I was probably too young to understand it at the time I played Mist, but it was a really, but now that I think about it, it's kind of really mind blowing that they can
Well, like
use that tool in that.
one example of like uh, collector's edition or whatever, giving you useful things, in my opinion, is honestly Fable 3.
Okay, go on.
Because it gave you a deck of cards, which everyone knows how to play with a deck of cards. I'd be surprised if they didn't, unless they're like 3 or younger. Um, and even then, they could figure it out. And it gave you the coin of good and evil, which I use all the time with recording it to make decisions.
Ah, the coin of good and evil.
I
That's
keep it
actually a
literally
sensible.
sitting on my desk at all times, just in case the decision needs to be made.
Um,
Hello?
Sorry, that's actually a really sensible extra to give the player.
Mm-hmm.
I I I use like a solid silver 2 shilling piece, but for the same purposes, but it's not as nice.
Yeah, no, one side clearly shows good, one side clearly shows evil. And it's
Yeah.
what made my decisions throughout the Fable games when I recorded them. And let's see, it was the Fables, and then there was another one that had a lot of more good and evil choices that I used it on.
Uh,
Um,
when I flip a coin to make a decision with my 2 shilling piece, I can only look at either a bunch of flowers or a philandering king.
oh, okay.
Because my coin is from the time of Edward VII, and screw that guy. No, Edward VIII. Screw that guy.
Oh,
He was the
okay.
only king of England to have resigned. So anyway,
Okay. I say we move on to uh,
yeah.
Battlefield 1.
Oh man, Battlefield One.
Before you go off on your historian tangent,
Yeah,
I'd just like to say that after watching the E3 footage of the game, it does not look like World War One to me. It looks more of a modern shooter. When I think World War One, and I've read books on some of the World War One battles and stuff like that.
yeah,
It's there's a lot of things that just don't add up with what uh they're doing for Battlefield One. And
yeah.
I'm sorry, I can't see the overall combat effectiveness of a Zeppelin. But that's just me.
Actually, that was one of the things I have to begrudgingly say they got kind of right.
Really?
Because there were actual Zeppelin raids on London where they dropped bombs on London.
Okay, but not like entering the middle of an active battlefield.
Uh, at first they did it, but then at first they did it early in the war, but then fighter technology caught up with them
Mm-hmm.
because these Zeppelins were used as spotters essentially.
Okay.
Then fighter technology caught up with them, and it just became untenable because
Well,
to make a Zeppelin that would survive in the sky, it would have needed to be a literal like floating fortress
that's
with
sort of
like
what they did for
too many machine guns and too much armor to survive.
yeah, like that's what they did in Battlefield 1 though. Is they made Zeppelins that are just like massive flying tanks essentially. They move super slow. They're literally littered with machine guns and anti-air guns, and it's just
And that's
like
why
I know. I don't care what you think. Zeppelins in that time were filled with hydrogen.
helium,
Oh, in here,
helium. They were filled
really?
with helium.
They were filled with
Yeah,
helium back then. I thought
yeah,
it was all
yeah.
hydrogen.
No. The Hindenburg was filled with hydrogen because the United States um, had a boycott on selling certain strategic goods to Nazi Germany.
Oh, okay.
The reason they filled it with hydrogen is because they couldn't get helium. There was
Because
there's
helium's
actual
really that more unsafe than hydrogen.
actually helium is perfectly safe. It's an inert gas. It
Yeah,
doesn't react. Yeah.
exactly. So why would you boycott that from Germany?
No, they boycotted it because it's useful in any number of industrial processes.
Oh, okay.
On top of it, the Germans could produce hydrogen through electrolysis and through any number of other means.
Okay.
Like hydrogen is actually really easy to make. If I were to just go on a chemistry tangent, I could teach you how to make hydrogen in your bedroom.
Hmm.
Like yeah, like pure oxygen and pure hydrogen. It's not actually that hard. Um, but no, helium is actually useful in a bunch of industrial processes, or it was at the time.
Mm-hmm.
So um, the United States boycotted it, or they wouldn't sell it to the Nazis
Hmm.
because it was one of those early efforts by the president to try and hold Hitler on a leash during the appeasement time. But anyway, you made a point about Battlefield One that I want to come back to, and I'm going to come back to a lot, and I'm going to harp on a lot
Okay.
because I'm a historian. I have 2 degrees in history, and on top of that, I currently work at a British regimental museum that deals with a regiment raised during the First World War.
Yep.
So I deal with a lot of First World War stuff.
This is why I actually wanted to bring up this topic with you.
Yeah. Battlefield One is the worst depiction of World War One that I have ever seen, and I expect to ever see. We're talking in pure terms of verisimilitude here. So I'm gonna make this concession to Battlefield One. It does what it does because it has to do that to hold the attention of the gaming audience in 2016.
Mm-hmm.
Um, there are certain gameplay conventions that it can't just disregard. The problem is World War One is a bad choice to fit with these conventions, to try and fit into these conventions.
Yeah,
Um,
we sort of established that as soon as we in a first podcast when we brought up Battlefield One and the fact that at the time it was rumored that it would be in World War One, and you said that would not work.
yeah, no, and now I get to fault. Now I get to get some payoff on that and explain why it doesn't work.
You get your "I told you so" moment.
Oh yeah, my big "I told you so" moment. Okay, so the first thing is modern shooter gameplay revolves around speed and I'm going to say this with giant air quotes skill.
Mm-hmm.
It revolves around movement and maneuver. Now, leaving aside the Eastern Front, we're going to come back to it, but we're going to leave it aside for a moment.
Mm-hmm.
Except for the last couple of months of the war in 1918 and the first couple of weeks of the war in 1914, the First World War on the Western Front was a meat grinder. It was a static positional war. You were not walking, you were not like dodging around or diving or circle strafing, or trying to maneuver around the enemy. You were walking at his machine gun,
Mm-hmm.
just directly at his machine gun. And it was the first combined arms war. So the entire ethic of the war was about, or the entire way the war was fought was about mixing infantry attacks
Mm-hmm.
with artillery support, and really refining indirect fire. So it was all about what was called the creeping bombardment and the phased lines of attack.
Mm-hmm.
So the idea was the bombardment would start relatively near to your lines and then draw forward, slowly reaching into no man's land to just pound the land so that there's nothing there. Then it would stop at a predetermined space, and 1,000 meters behind that was the phased line of advance, which is where the infantry would advance to. They would then wait there in whatever cover was available. And then the bombardment would move forward a predetermined amount, and then 1,000 or so meters behind that, the infantry would advance to that next phase line of attack until the artillery was pounding the enemy position itself. It would do that for a while, and then the infantry, while the enemy was suppressed by the artillery and in theory by their own machine guns in the back, would rush onto the enemy with an infantry charge.
Mm-hmm.
And this was exactly as bloody and horrifying as you think it was. There's a great video of World War One soldiers marching out of their trenches, and in the 5 seconds of this video, you witness 3 men die.
Yeah.
And that's just how the war was. The moment they were getting out of the trenches, because they were still figuring out how to pin the enemy down and suppress them, massive casualties as they walked right at each other. Actually,
Yeah.
the best example of World War One combat is probably the movie Passchendaele.
I've never actually seen that movie. I want to, though.
Oh, it's like, okay. Well, for our non-Canadian viewers or listeners, I think it was sponsored by the CBC. I'm not sure. It was a Canadian-made war movie about the First World War and the Battle of Passchendaele, starring Paul Gross and somebody whose name I don't remember. But it was really good, really critically acclaimed, brilliant movie. At the same time, the ending scene is the most realistic depiction of World War One I've ever seen. 90% of it is men sitting in dirty shell holes dying, and that's that.
Mm-hmm.
Sitting in their shell holes dying as they get shot to pieces by the Germans. And that was the war.
Yeah, it was
The reason this doesn't work.
that Battlefield 1 tries to be.
Yeah, well, that's the key. Modern shooters thrive on an almost eternal skirmish.
Mm-hmm.
They're all about sort of fast, quick maneuver war, or not even maneuver war, movement-based warfare. Maneuver war is something completely different. And we don't want to start me talking about the Soviet way of war, because then I would just never stop.
Yeah.
Basically, modern shooter gameplay is heavily revolved around being able to put bullets down range without also moving out of the way of enemy bullets. It actually very much resembles aerial combat and fighter dogfights.
Mm-hmm.
Sort of a two-dimensional dogfight, if you will. The problem is, if we're going to be honest about, like, if we're going to give a real presentation of what World War One is about, World War One was fought at bayonet point with bolt-action rifles. I think it was 98% of the weapons produced for the First World War, in terms of small arms, and not including grenades, were bolt-action rifles.
Mm-hmm.
Like these were the guns that dominated the war. They were the guns with which the war was fought. I bet you any money there's not a single Lee Enfield, not a single Kar 98, not a single Lebel anywhere in the game.
Oh, they have bolt-action rifles, but
they're sniper rifles.
Yeah,
right?
the most you consider sniper rifles, and most people are running around with like SMGs and stuff like that. It's like
guns, most of which were only introduced in the last months of the war.
Yeah, and
the SMG and the machine gun are the complete antithesis of what World War One combat was like.
Yeah, there's actually, in the video I saw, someone used a semi-automatic rifle. At some point.
A semi-automatic rifle.
Yeah.
I think might be the Huot.
I don't know. It never gave me a name of the rifle or anything.
Yeah, well, the Huot was a Canadian-built automatic rifle during the First World War that I think got partially used by the Seaforth Highlanders. It was a shit gun made of shit. because it was based on the Ross rifle, which was broken.
Okay.
Like it was because it was a straight pull bolt action, and that kind of action gets really easily fouled at the time, or at the time would get really easily fouled. Um,
But in the game, it'll never jam.
of course it won't, and that's the key here. World War I is not a heroic war. It's not a fun war. It's not a pleasant war like World War II is. And I'm not saying World War II was a good war or was a good war to be in, but compared to World War II on the West, if you're on the West, if you're part of the Allies, World War II was a cakewalk compared to World War One.
Hmm.
World War One was hell on earth. It 90% of the war was sitting in a trench being shot at, and it was a god awful mess. It wasn't an exciting sort of skirmish. It was the it was the time when modern armies were brutally it was a time when modern armies were brutally dispossessed of the notion that Napoleonic style tactics still functioned at all.
Hmm.
That the line and the battalion were were still was were still relevant in warfare as a model of attack, because it was a war where the defensive became where defense overwhelmed attack in terms of its ability to dominate the battlefield.
Hmm.
So any game that depicts World War One is not going to be this sort of fast moving,
Yeah.
exciting like this fast moving, exciting thing. It's going to be a hellish positional war and a hellish positional gameplay where you're stuck sitting in a trench hole firing a bolt action rifle at another guy in a trench hole, and the guy who happens to live through it gets to move forward.
Hmm.
Problem is that is not fun to play.
Yeah. It
So they
it
did,
does not work with modern audiences.
yeah.
And
So
besides, if a game just sort of started having like things like guns jamming, or if you want the unreliability of tanks in that era,
that's another thing. Tanks in that era,
like that segue.
yeah, tanks in that era. That oh god, that's another thing that I find ridiculous because the tank in that era was not the. I'm going to pause for a moment and go forward in time to World War II. World War II is when tanks came into their own as essentially a
Hmm.
surrogate cavalry, when they became a fast-moving weapon of breakthrough, which is what you see in most sort of depictions of tanks, and unfortunately, what you also see here.
Yeah.
If you look at the gameplay footage of tanks in Battlefield One,
Hmm.
the British Mark, I think it's the Mark One. I can never remember exactly which it is. The rhomboidal original tank, the the first of the first.
One with naval guns on it.
Yeah, literally. Um, the sponson based rhomboidal British tanks. They were barely faster than a man. Like a human being could walk faster than them. And the advantage they had is that they were basically invulnerable to every single thing that could be thrown at it except a direct artillery shot.
Hmm.
They were they were moving fortresses. However, in the gameplay footage, they're shown as these fast moving, like
Yeah.
these
And
fast moving breakthrough machines. And the problem I have with this is that I think it would actually get the problem I have with a lot of these things is that I think to a certain extent it would actually be more interesting for gameplay to explore to explore what the First World War was sort of actually like. To make a game that instead of relying on a player's ability to circle straight or the player's ability to jump or the
bunny
player's
hopping.
ability to, yeah, or even the player's ability to have a sort of finger twitch that gets them the first shot, that rather forces them to, really, really forces them to play positional warfare. Like moving, trying to genuinely figure out the passage from point A to point B that will not get you shot at by the guy in a position with a machine gun.
That the problem with that kind
And
of
the thing
gameplay.
with
Oh,
I want to say one thing about tanks.
okay.
And the thing with tanks is they could actually be used to reinforce this, as they could, as a big slow moving uber fortress, they could be used to create temporary strong points on the battlefield,
Uh-huh.
so that they can support positional play. And I mean, game executives will never do this, because it would be it would involve taking a chance at something at all. But it would be interesting to experiment with, to sort of break the mold.
Yeah, but the problem with that kind of gameplay is it's the most modern audiences the the playing the game so they don't have to think. Hence why most game campaigns are not difficult to get through. There might be like one or two challenges, but other than that, they're not difficult. If you have to
True.
start actually making the player think, that game's not going to do very well because I'm
Yeah,
sorry, most modern gamers are idiots.
that is true. A lot of them are. Probably not our viewers, because I mean, I referenced Dumas, and I've been talking about about all manner of like really intellectual stuff, but so I have faith in our
You'd be
audience. But
surprised.
yeah, I would be surprised. Um, Still, they with this sort of resurgence of stealth-based gameplay, and the whole and the whole thing with not Battlefield, Spec Ops: The Line.
Hmm.
I I think we could have been in for a really interesting change up, and that I think audiences are willing to accept a lot more than they're given credit for.
Yeah. Uh,
Yeah,
it there's still quite a few people that don't like things like Spec Ops: The Line and stuff like that. So I mean,
well,
everyone has their niche that they like.
that's true, but that's a problem with games as art,
Hmm.
and a problem with how games are understood by their audience.
Yeah.
And to a certain extent, and some people who like games don't like the idea of gaming becoming a art form, if you will, like film, or like theater or literature, and that's fair.
Been like that for a
I,
long time though.
yeah, my issue with that is, or with the desire not to take chances, is the reality that cuts off a lot of experiences
Hmm.
and a lot of new interesting ideas. I mean, if you just decide that all you want to eat is fried meat and potatoes, um, that's nice, but you're missing out.
Yeah.
You're objectively missing out. And I don't think it's fair to make everyone eat fried meat and potatoes.
Yeah. That's why personally I really enjoy games like the Fallouts and stuff like that, where you don't have to play stealth. You don't have to. You could essentially just play the game your way. The world's gonna do its thing, but you just are interacting with that world in
True,
whatever way
true.
you see fit.
But in and I think I think it's particularly prescient in for the Battlefield series,
Hmm.
because what they're doing is trying to drape World War I over a very, very modern sort of sensibility of what war is.
Yeah.
Um, Being a historian and encountering war a lot, war is fucking boring.
Hmm.
Like 90% of war is incredibly goddamn boring. Um, Myself and Shakeblade are actually involved in playing a game of playing a play by email game of Steel Panthers, the free remake of it at least.
Hmm.
And I think Shadeblade can say that so far it's been all logistics, right?
Yeah, it's been a lot of like positioning, and you don't know where your enemy is, and
It's just, but not even that. Like I'm playing on the defensive. I've got a prepared position. I'm sort of almost in the World War One sense. But since you're moving and you're the advancing party, like isn't so far a lot of the gameplay about just keeping trucks on the road and keeping
hmm,
formations together?
yeah,
Like a lot, like I would I've played a lot of strategy gaming games before. And I think that's the key. Like a lot of actual war is traffic control, like is being a traffic cop.
hmm.
Um,
And I had
and
to learn very quickly with that game that like terrain is definitely a factor, because it's like
yeah,
it factors how far your forces can move. And for the situation we're playing, I have a lot of forces I need to move, and there's
yeah,
no
we're
select all key. I
yeah,
move them all
unfortunately,
individually.
well, yeah, that's a limitation of the engine though.
Yeah,
It's also a limitation of the forces we chose.
yes,
We're, we're, I'm not going to reveal too much about it because that would require Shadeblade to talk more about it, and where the game is still technically in progress.
yeah.
Um, but we're doing a scenario, 1948 Chinese Civil War, so both sides are pretty infantry heavy.
Hmm.
So there's a so it with that kind of stage, or with that kind of scale and that kind of top down perspective, it allows it's an experience I think I wish more players had.
Hmm.
More play people who play military shooters had, so that they could see sort of the context for why these things are happening. And even if they don't like it, it doesn't that doesn't take away from the fact that it would really, I think, give clarity as to like war isn't just like 4 years of men dancing in circles shooting submachine guns at each other.
Hmm.
Like there's definitely there's a whole other side of it. And I
Yeah.
think that that's actually where a lot of modern military shooters have a huge problem. They only portray this one side of war, these very small.
Yeah, they're either dancing around circles, shooting some machine guns at each other, or there's one person sitting in a corner, laying down in some grass, and just
Yeah,
waiting on one, staring at one position.
yeah, it's this very like, I don't want to say artificial. It's a greatest hits of war,
Hmm.
and it's and I think to a certain extent it does come out of Doom and Serious Sam and the
Hmm.
early World War II shooters like the early Medal of Honor and the early Call of Duties, where this entire model was established when there were processor and graphical limitations on what they could and could not do. But I think like now that we have been able to move beyond now that we've been able to move beyond a lot of those, I think it might be time to really start thinking and examining not just not just like first person shooters as a genre and thinking more sort of deeply about them, but also attempting to think about how our settings affect, or how the limitations of setting and what we put into our military shooters, how that affects the stories we can tell.
Hmm.
Because there's actually one thing that really bothered me about Battlefield One, sorry, that um, yeah, that really bothered me, and it's about the story, or not about the story, but it's about the sort of one of what I feel is a narrative choice, I guess.
I was about to say, what story?
Yeah, exactly. It's sort of a sort of a narrative choice about how they choose to present the First World War.
Hmm.
Um, that in the multiplayer, which is what a lot of people are going to be playing, why they're getting this game, is that the French don't appear.
Uh-huh.
And um,
And correct me if I'm wrong, weren't the French like part of World War One from the very beginning?
it goes deeper than that.
Okay.
The French are the reasons. The French are the reason that one didn't just stay a small, limited war between Russia and Austria-Hungary. The French were the reason that it became a world war.
And they don't appear in Battlefield 1.
Oh no, it's ridiculous. But I think sort of parsing out why it's ridiculous, parsing out why they don't appear is a huge thing. If you look
Mm-hmm.
at who does appear, just for a moment, tell me who does appear in the Battlefield game in Battlefield One.
Germans, British, uh, uh, don't know exactly all of them. I know the German, British are there. I don't know. I don't
The
know
Yanks
World War One
as
enough to
well.
know.
It's the Yanks and the Russians as well.
Okay,
Um, and
they better have
that's
Vimy Ridge DLC for Canada.
oh, of course they're not going to.
Huh? That's like Canada's first moment of real kick ass in war.
I know, but you can't have everything.
Well, minus
But
1812.
the point I want to make though is, if you think about it, who also gets what are the okay? So we've got Canada, not Canada, Britain, Germany, Russia, and America appearing in the multiplayer.
Mm-hmm.
What countries generally appear in World War II games? In first-person shooters.
Oh, that's easy. Those four. Literally
Exactly.
those four. It's always
Yeah.
Russia, America, Britain, and German. And maybe
Yes.
occasionally you get the Japanese in there too.
Well, yeah. If you're fighting against them, never playing as them.
Yeah.
And I think that's the problem. I think that it's the way Battlefield 1 has been designed is an extension of the Second World War back into the first. That it's attempting to use the shorthands of World War II to portray World War One. And I mean, yeah, there's this whole sort of thing of the cheese eating surrender monkey, which is okay, I guess that's one interpretation of the French's military activities during the Second World War. Um, at the same time, if anybody thinks that that is characteristic of France's military performance overall,
They should look at
um,
Napoleon.
not even look at Napoleon. They don't know European history.
Okay.
Particularly, they don't know French military history during the First World War,
Mm-hmm.
because the the French in the First World War formed the bulk of the Allied army. From day one to the end to the last day on the Western Front, they formed the bulk of the Allied army. I think I think it was the the lowest concentration of French troops on the front was 70% of the Allied army. That's a rough statistic, but I think that's somewhere around uh, the lowest number of French troops on the front as a portion of the Allied armies.
Mm-hmm.
French, the French held the line.
Yeah.
There was, and on top of it, most of these sort of iconic battles of the First World War were French battles. Not even talking about just Verdun. Also, the Miracle on the Marne in particular.
Mm-hmm.
Um, for anybody who doesn't know, the Miracle on the Marne was France's last stand. The Germans, as they pushed through Belgium and into France, had much of the French army on the left flank in a shambles,
Mm-hmm.
because they were moving in a way that the French had not expected. So what happened was the French had pulled back, except for the isolated pockets that simply couldn't, and they established a rough defensive line along the Marne River.
Mm-hmm.
After, at the same time, this was right they had uh, when the French had managed to bring up their conscripts, and they had managed to get their conscripts armed and prepared. And they literally sent them to the front by any means possible. They almost literally threw their conscripts into battle. Some arriving by foot, some arriving by horse-drawn carriage, some arriving by Paris taxi cab. They threw, yes, it,
That is
some of
amazing.
yes, they threw these men into battle in taxi cab, and they held they held the line against Germany and restored French national pride after the end of the Franco-Prussian War and the very, to France, traumatic loss of Alsace-Lorraine. Um, and France gave so much of its blood that even now there's barely a village in France, like two or three houses along the road, where there isn't a little monument that says that lists names and says during the Great War these men died for France.
Hmm. Well,
It
that's the
was, it was,
thing.
it was this huge moral project of national honor.
Hmm.
And I think to forget that is almost to misunderstand what World War One is about.
Yeah. Well, it's like there's a reason why World War I they called it the war to end all wars because it was just such a bloody slog through.
And well, yeah, it was such a bloody slog. On top of it, um, I think what they would have done better is to focus on the Eastern Front. If they had just made a game focusing on the Eastern Front,
Hmm.
that would have played a lot better to the stereotypes they're thinking of,
Hmm.
or they're trying to play with, because that was very much a war of maneuver. Um, the confused, chaotic melee at Masurian Lakes, for example, is a prime example of exactly why. Uh, so I'm just trying to remember the battles of the Masurian Lakes
Hmm.
because there were um, are a great example of why or uh, how the battlefield depiction of war as
Hmm.
a general concept would fit, because basically the Russians attacked into a bog, and the Germans counterattacked into a bog after gassing each other with I think it was tear gas. I don't
Hmm.
think that they were up to using poison gas just yet, but they attacked each other into this basically boggy mess, and it became rather than the very um, structured and planned and prepared positional war on the Western Front, this chaotic series of barely connected um, this chaotic series of barely connected melees,
Hmm.
where where coherence and um, where coherence between the armies broke down. But
Yeah.
that's only because on both sides the planning was so terrible that they couldn't really control their armies. So they that's when you get that was at least in World War One when you got that kind of sort of battlefield esque
Hmm.
um,
But even then, it
action.
sounds like it was a lot more melee combat than running
Sure,
around with
sure, sure.
SMGs constantly.
Well, they were these battles were in 1914 and 1915 respectively. So
Hmm.
there were two battles in the Sorbian Lakes. So they both occurred before SMGs and mobile machine guns were a thing.
Hmm.
So we're talking about hordes of Russian conscripts marching at hordes of German conscripts, and both of them just getting bogged down in this messy bog.
Hmm.
Um, so the kind of warfare that Battlefield 1 depicts only ever really happened by accident. When any sort of command and control evaporated in a conflict where command and control still moved at pigeon speed.
Yeah.
So yeah, and I think that almost exemplifies the failings of what are the stylistic failings of Battlefield One.
Yeah.
That they're trying to depict a war they don't understand using stylistic conventions that weren't designed for it, and don't really do a good job of conveying a meaningful experience. The experience, I want to say, the reason what they're doing is not wrong or bad or whatever. The problem is, I think that it is important to give for games to give a real meaningful experience to the player, and to, even if the player doesn't want to necessarily let the player walk away with sort of a feeling,
Hmm.
like an important feeling.
And I think
And
with that, the chicken has walked away.
exactly.
Good night, everybody.
Good night, everybody.